If we need Michael, just
Yeah. I'll hit that again. Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of the Regeneration Podcast. I'm here with my good friend as always, Michael Martin, and we'll introduce our guest momentarily. Michael Martin, our name, Regeneration, you know where it has a prominent role?
Let me guess.
Tell me.
In William Blake.
Yeah. I was rereading, kind of related to this interview. I was rereading. It's my third book, and I heard that Harold Bloom tried to read it hundreds of times. But Northrop Frye and William Blake, and William Blake saw loss as his prophetic figure in his poetry as the shaper of regeneration. So I think we've taken a good name for our podcast today, ladies and gentlemen. We have.
Hey, wait.
Yeah, go, please.
But that's not where I got the title from, as much as I am a William Blake fanboy.
Tell me more.
I got the title from Henry Vaughan, the metaphysical poet. The first poem of his collection, Silex Scintillans, is indeed entitled Regeneration.
Oh, wow.
And that his entire project, which is very connected to Christian Hermeticism, is grounded in the idea of the regeneration of man, of society, and of the church, and of nature.
Your PhD, you've been barking up this tree for a long time.
Yeah. Barking is the right word.
when he wasn't playing.
What's that, David?
When he wasn't playing that banjo, I can see in the background.
Yeah, he's a professional musician. So you just heard the voice of our guest today, David Cayley. David Cayley has worked, and we'll have him tell us more about himself, but his major life's body of work was at the CBC, a CBC program called Ideas. And I encourage everybody, we'll get his website address many times, davidcayley.com. We're going to be talking about his whole body of work. David Cayley, I'm going to say later that he's kind of the Wendell Berry of Canada, but he also can be compared in Canada, I believe, to something like a Ken Burns. But let me make a distinction there. Ken Burns, I see as kind of a Whig historian, but David Cayley, in doing seminal interviews about and with people like Rene Girard, about David Cayley, a whole monumental series on science. And people know him now mostly through his recent biography, Ivan Illich, an intellectual biography. He's the opposite of a Whig historian. Some of your thought is overtly anarchistic. Do you ever see it that way? And again, welcome, David Cayley.
Thank you. I wonder if all your listeners know what the CBC is.
Say it.
The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Okay. Yeah.
Here you go. Here's some trivia. So I re-listened to your series on William Blake recently, and in the middle of one of the interviews with Kathleen Ray, and I said, "Wait a minute, I've heard this before," because I'm from Detroit, and we get the CBC.
Yes,
Detroit, or at least we used to in Detroit. Yeah. So I was very plugged into Canadian television.
Oh, that's very nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So I heard it before. Yeah.
Okay,
when it came out long ago.
Good.
And tell us more about yourself. And I'm going to kind of hit a tagline of William Blake. And today we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking to you, and I'm grateful for this, for 2 weeks in a row. And I know the listeners are grateful too, because you've interviewed the seminal people. You've been following what I would consider as a golden thread that really can help us unlock so many doors. And today, if we focus, we know we're going to hit the names Simone, Weil, William Blake, and Rene Girard, and I hope to bring in some others. But tell us about yourself, and I want to kind of give us a key line for me from Northrop Frye, who you also interviewed, who's an intellectual in his own right that needs to be reckoned with during our time. But tell us more about yourself, David.
Well, starting where?
Wherever you want to start, let me put it that way.
That's a long story. It's a long story.
I'm very
conscious of how long it is. Why don't we start with the CBC?
Yeah.
After spending 2 years living in North Borneo with an organization called the Canadian University Service Overseas, which is somewhat comparable, although it predates your Peace Corps. I returned to Toronto all on fire with this, opening political world for me, right? And it was then that I discovered Illich as the most penetrating critic of the development enterprise of which CUSO, Canadian University Service Overseas, was a part. I mean, I had not, I think I was probably seeking adventure more than international development, but
As so many people in
nevertheless,
the Peace Corps are, right?
exactly. But I had been precipitated, if you want, into this, and so I discovered Illich, and we put on teach-ins, and the whole critique of development was really the starting point for me. But at some point, I needed to make a living, a little less hand to mouth, and so I discovered that the CBC would be a place where I could work and follow the interests that I had, while at the same time, gaining a thin livelihood. So that was a pretty important discovery for me, and that occurred around 1971. So my interests were all political, as in keeping with the time. I mean, I didn't know what was going on around me. I don't think anyone exactly knew what was going on around me. It's been important for me with Ivan Illich, in going back over his work and producing this book you mentioned, which is called Intellectual Journey, that he was very much in that moment thinking this. I mean, that you can, when you reread him, you can see that he was absolutely thinking that deschooling society was a possibility, that it might happen, indeed that it would happen, that it was going to happen. And he was, in a certain sense, right, that something did happen, but it just wasn't what it didn't. It took the opposite form than the one he had hoped for, as
Doubling down,
as things often do in the world. But I was also in that moment and completely unsure of what it was, in the sense that I would be reading Marx, as Marx himself says, that you could be a fisherman in the morning and a critic in the afternoon and a shepherd in the evening. Well, I was like that too. I was reading the economic and philosophical manuscripts. I was reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I was throwing the I Ching. All this somehow allowed me to still think of myself as belonging to the new left in the kind of vague Port Huron statement way, right? So all that came to a crisis in the later 70s, after I had been fired for exceeding the bounds of politically correct discourse.
At the CBC?
In Vancouver in 1976.
Oh, wow. That's what I thought. I thought you were anarchistic. I knew you must have been in trouble at some point.
So the precipitating issue, actually, I'm happy to be able to speak about this, was the extradition of Leonard Peltier, the American Indian movement leader who was accused of killing 2 FBI agents, fled to Canada. There was an extradition hearing in Vancouver, and he was sent back to the United States and has been in prison more or less ever since for 2 murders, which now everyone knows, including, I would suppose, Barack Obama and others, that he did not commit.
Wow.
But seeing Peltier, who had, in the second Wounded Knee aftermath, he had been active at the Pine Ridge reservation. And it's a long story. I won't go into it here. It's well told in a movie by Michael Apted and in a long book by Peter Matheson.
What's the name of the movie, David?
In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, it's Peter Matheson's book. The movie, I think, is called Incident at Oglala.
Okay.
And both cover this question of Leonard Peltier, who I have just been, I just prayed that Barack Obama would let him out. I can't believe that it didn't come to his attention that he could do it.
I'm sure it came.
but
as
nobody dares to defy the FBI, seemingly,
No.
who suborned perjury to get him there, and I guess we'll leave him there till he dies. But seeing him brought shackled into a Vancouver courtroom, in a certain sense, lost my mind, and thought, well, this is my moment to speak. Like this whole history is present here now, and I spoke in a very unbridled way, and lost my job. So that was the moment to really have to rethink, well, what was this movement that I identified with? What had it been? What was it, right? I can remember one morning at the radio program I worked at in Vancouver, I said to an old friend, Stan Persky was his name. I said, Stan, I don't think I'm really a Marxist. And Stan said, of course you're a Marxist. We're all Marxists. But I wasn't a Marxist. So I gradually had to begin to try and think this all through.
Yeah.
And providentially, after a couple of years of independent study and writing, after I got fired, I went back to the CBC in Toronto. I discovered ideas as a place where I could make radio programs that really, furthered this inquiry. That was a wonderful discovery. It started with a series called Between Two Ages in 1981, which kind of allowed me to try and open out this new age perspective, if you want to call it that, which I had probably had all along, at least from the moment when I read Dietrich Bonhoeffer as a teenager, or Carl Jung would be another important source for me of this new age concept, so that's a very sketchy summary.
Has anybody else done this with you? That was fascinating. I mean, and I want you to continue. Has anybody else kind of interviewed you at length on this stuff? Like you were one of these people who found themselves in kind of the stream of history and reacted.
I would say no.
Responded. Okay.
I have not tried to answer these questions before. No.
Wow. I feel so fortunate, not in all sincerity.
Absolutely.
So we're gonna keep on weaving that story, your story, which is going to be really the focus of these, in and out, But it was interesting to hear you say that, if I'm right, even before that first firing, it kind of goes Illich, that a whole cascade of events happened to you, and then kind of Illich was a constant companion, literally and figuratively. Is that accurate?
That's absolutely true. So all those books of the early 70s that Ivan wrote, the Deschooling Society, notably Tools for Conviviality, Medical Nemesis, some others, really formed me in that kind of decentralist, degrowth, learning to find enoughness perspective, which I never lost, and which seemed to me the major stumbling block for the whole left-right way of seeing the world, right? Is that it can't comprehend scale. But scale is a crucial issue for us, related to technology, obviously, which is the generator of vast scales. But the scale issue, I would closely connect to Ivan.
Scale is hugely important to me. Let's play with scale for a while. So we're going to do William Blake, but we're going to bring in Leopold Kohr on scale too. Okay. Yeah. But I in reading Northrop Frye and William Blake, regarding scale, as you know, and in this book, it is so central, Northrop Frye's fearful symmetry, is that something I've been mining at these articles at Front Porch Republic on, why we always favor how small we are in the universe when we look at the stars, as opposed to how big we are, as opposed to like really small things. I've always wondered, why do we just slant one equation? I've come out with my own writings to say, slanting it in one that you're tiny, you're pond scum, David, and Michael. That's kind of Stephen Hawking. It leads to war, it leads to the end of romantic love, and it leads to perpetual adolescence. But I had written all these articles. I joked with my kids, it was my minor trilogy. But I also picked up only for the first time Fearful Symmetry last year. And again, I think I'm on my third reading. But this is just the center of that book, that William Blake thought this notion of just endless space, cold, dead space, would lead, and I'm going to quote from Fearful Symmetry, whether it's a direct connection or not. Blake, Northrop Frye says, it remains true that the physical world is not good enough for the imagination to accept. And if we do accept it, we are left with our selfhoods, capital S for Blake, right? Our verminous, crawling egos that spend all their time either wrongdoing others or brooding on wrongs done to them. The end of all natural religion, however well-meaning and good-natured, is a corrupt and decadent society rolling downhill to stampeding mass hysteria and maniacal warfare. This is the historical secession to deism, which William Blake in Jerusalem symbolized as Druidism, for reasons to be explained in due course. But that William Blake saw that this, because we're going to talk about science a lot, David, but that William Blake saw this kind of objectification of the outside world in due course. I said it led to perpetual adolescence. I see warfare. I saw the end of romantic love. But he said, essentially mass psychosis and maniacal warfare. Talk about William Blake, how, was it through Illich that some part of Illich threw you back to him? And I know, Michael, you know a lot about William Blake, so you're going to jump right in.
Well, with me and Blake, it was a almost childish love of his poems that it began with, and growing up with the songs of innocence and experience. But the prophetic poems, I think I was really, Kathleen Rane was the important person, even before Nori Fry was reading Kathleen Rane, that opened Blake to me. And then obviously Fearful Symmetry. I'm very happy to hear Northrop Frye's name mentioned, because he's really pretty much forgotten in any milieu that I know.
Breaks my heart.
And I don't think that he was a very important teacher.
Yeah, Northrop Frye is the Canadian Harold Bloom, right?
Okay.
those are a couple names that are never to be mentioned in academia.
And Harold Bloom said he read Fearful Symmetry. I honestly think maybe it was in your book on Northrop Frye, David, but said he read it hundreds of times.
Bloom loved Frye. Yeah. So anyway, Blake was very important to me, but you've more or less said why already.
Well, and Kathleen Rane, I know in a book I have of hers, Golgonooza, I think the first line of the first essay in there said that William Blake's whole corpus is the only one in history that pitted the real issue as science versus the imagination.
Yes.
What was imagination for William Blake? Again, for young people, it means Marvel action heroes, which are more of the same, somebody's strong. So a superhero is really strong, so that must be imagination. Or it means like decamping to outer space. This place is boring, so I'm going to go to outer space. And that uses my imagination. Is that a case of the worst being the corruption of the best for William Blake, or how would you guys describe that? Michael, Michael's a poet too.
Well, for me, it's weird for me, William Blake, I went in the opposite direction of most people. I was about 22 years old. I don't think I'd ever read anything by Blake. And a friend of mine gave me a copy of Jerusalem. So I jumped in at the deep end of the pool.
You went into the deep end, yeah.
Yeah. And I give it, and he literally gave me the end of a golden string, and it led me into this world of William Blake. And that's where the title of the journal I edit came from. It's Jesus the Imagination, right? So William Blake led me to Kathleen Rane, because there was this used bookstore. This is in about 1985, probably. This used bookstore had the 2-volume Blake and Tradition by Kathleen Rane. up on this shelf, and it was, I don't know, $80 or something. And I didn't have $80, but I saved up until I had $80, and I bought that copy, and I still have it.
Oh, beautiful.
And and Kathleen Rain, like Blake, opened up this whole world of what a literary critic could be, which was a literary criticism of the imagination, and not a kind of scientific approach where we murder to dissect. That's most literary criticism, is either trying to prove that the author is a fraud, is subscribe, what you should see in Marxist or feminist criticism. It's they're always trying to pull away the curtain. But Rain wasn't doing that. And she was opening up the poetry to show you the wonders within it, like Coleridge would do. And this is what Blake did for me, not just in terms of what poetry could be, but in terms of what a human existence could be. And I really think that it was kind of a time bomb for me, that which exploded, and it's kind of colored everything I've done ever since. Well, I remember we were talking the other day. I hosted a conference on the imagination at the Waldorf school where I used to teach way back in the day, and it was all colored by that. I was in graduate school at the same time. I was deep into this exploration of the imagination, which was actually my master's thesis was on the imagination. So Blake is tremendously important, and I think, Mike, you pointed out where he called it so long ago. He and Goethe called it so long ago about the absolute dangers of this, what we now call scientism, right? They were prophetic voices because they saw where it was headed. Prophets don't need to be clairvoyant; they just need to be logical. And I think Illich is the same way. He can they're clear thinking people who see where this is headed.
Yeah.
And actually, pardon me, 2022 is where they were headed, which is the rise of the technocracy and the medical oppression, if you want to say.
Yes. Do you want me to carry that on, Mike?
I do very much.
Well, I would say much the same as what Michael just said. I mean, that phrase, Jesus the imagination, I can remember, which I think is in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Just was so arresting for me, and Rain and Fry obviously were helpful to me in understanding it, but it seemed to me it opened the whole question of religion, which seems to be such a stumbling block for people, right? That I don't know if I can say this well, but Fry once said something to me which stuck, which was that he said that the whole hierarchy, in which people had imagined, right, God's at the top, cascades down, fourfold, or like probably could be sixfold or eightfold, it's fourfold in medieval imagery, that Blake, he says, turns it upside down, right? That God is at the bottom, within, trying to rebuild, regeneration. That everything begins at the bottom, which is the same imagery you will get later in Freud and Jung and the underworld. I mean, this perhaps the most prominent myth. I've read this recently somewhere of the 20th century. But it starts in Blake with that rebuilding. But I mean, I think it also, for me, it short-circuited or transfigured perhaps the whole question of religion, which is, which people are, what do you believe? Are you an atheist? Aren't you an atheist? Do you believe this? Don't you believe that? These people believe this, those people believe that. So therefore, this can never be solved or settled. Therefore, let's put it all aside, right? Is to think of this, if you think of this as an imaginative enterprise, it's put on an entirely different footing.
Mhm.
And then what's interesting is what people's experience is, right? What they have to compare, to share, to explore with each other as this rebuilding unfolds. So it completely, it shatters the authoritative pre-given universe that it seems as if everyone is constantly trying to rebuild, right? That the last 2 years are another reactionary attempt at rebuilding. Oh, we'll have a biocracy. That'll get everybody back in order, right? Or a technocracy, or whatever you want to call it. It's a constant attempt to restore order. Oh, we'll follow science, right? Restoring order is always the theme, restoring the proper place of everything. And Blake is about finding out, right?
Mm.
It's about finding out.
And there's this plasticity in his conceptual life. If you look at, and he wasn't afraid to grow. So you look at the William Blake of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, very different guy from the William Blake of Jerusalem, right?
Yeah, really.
Where he's really worked through his interrogation or his concerns about establishment Christianity, and he resolves back on Jesus, the imagination in Jerusalem. And also even the term Jerusalem, what does it mean? It means one thing in Milton, in the preface to Milton, means a different thing in the book.
Yeah.
The emanation of the giant Albion. You think about, one of my favorite moments in Jerusalem is when Loss is agonizing and his specter splits away from him, right? And how profoundly insightful into human psychology this guy who never went to school was.
Yes.
William Blake, right?
Yeah.
Profound.
And
so Jerusalem, the rebuilding of Jerusalem is not just it's not just the city. It's so much more in this epic Jerusalem, which I have hesitated to bring before college students because I don't know if they can handle it. I teach the songs of innocence and of an experience all the time, but Jerusalem, you gotta find a specialized audience.
And there's a hopeful part of it too. Go ahead, Michael.
Because it demands of the reader something.
Mm-hmm.
It demands engagement, right? It demands that you struggle through what William Blake was struggling through as he came to this. And I think probably the core of that poem is Blake's which you see, he comes to not just an understanding, but a realization of what forgiveness is, right? Look at, I'm the most sinful of all men, yet I am forgiven. That Jesus, the divine imagination, forgives me, right? It's when I read that, I think it really changed my perspective about so much.
I forgive you, you forgive me. This is the bread, this is the wine, or
Mm-hmm.
It's so central that he'll water the whole. He believed that forgiveness piece was the only truly unique part of the gospel. And I just know a lot of people want to know, we're not going to talk about Illich now, but I have a degree in theology, but I always wondered what makes this thing unique. That's why when Rivers North of the Future came out, David, that the first chapter on Illich is talking about the gospel. Of course, he uses the Good Samaritan, and I am going to definitely kick that down the road. But again, at least William Blake offers, David, you're saying, cataclysmic change, short-circuited. But if it takes a short-circuiting to say, what's unique about the gospel, then we need to be there. I find too that I almost want to hold both of you guys to say, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, we have this cultural notion of imagination, which is we see our son or grandson scribbling a guy with 5 arms or something. We say, oh, Hoozle Fritz has imagination. For Blake, it was something robustly different. And I kind of want to hold maybe both your feet to the fire to say, like, what is he talking about? I mean, we all claim to kind of know what it is. Go, David. Yeah.
Well, Carl Jung, I think, helps.
Okay.
Was always helpful to me and inspiring to me. And I'm often surprised that Jung is so much forgotten in philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there are, our intellectual life is divided up into non-communicating schools. So maybe there's a Jungian school, of course.
Not much. If you go even in psychology programs, there's not much. Go ahead.
Like it was.
If you look at contemporary European philosophy, it's obsessed with Freud, and Jung is never mentioned, which is strange for me. But Jung talks about objective psyche, by which he simply means that the psyche is real, right? And I think that helps with Blake because something is actually going on, right? Jung is saying, he may not be right, but that God is changing. I mean, that's answer to Job.
Mm-hmm.
One of his great late works traces the actual changing of the God image within the psyche. Now, Jung was agnostic about the God who is not in the psyche.
Is
God,
that Blake's Nobo Daddy? Would you say that's an exact equivalent there?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Jung took the stance of a scientist.
Yeah, right.
He said, I will speak about what I know. What I don't know, I will not pass judgment on. He never, whether man made the gods or the gods made man is the question he leaves unaddressed. But he insists that these are real changes occurring within real people, right? So, and that for me is absolutely crucial, right? Because we don't know what we're seized by, right? I mean, if we go back to the current period, the beginning of the pandemic, March 2020, where I was living, probably the same where you were living, something absolutely astonishing happens, right?
Absolutely.
A massive change in people's orientation occurs, and they don't mostly even notice that it has occurred, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the foundation of modern medical ethics? Nuremberg. No medical procedure is to be imposed on an unwilling person absolutely ever again. We've seen that. We'll never return to that. Informed consent is de rigueur, right? Public health is about the health of all, right? Masks don't work against respiratory viruses, right? What else? It's just all these things are patent, and suddenly they're all changed. Quarantine is for the sick, right? And suddenly, within almost weeks, one can say,
absolutely,
all those things have been altered. We care about nothing but COVID-19. Nothing else matters. We can do unlimited damage to anyone, anywhere, as long as we contain this one enemy, this one plague, this one, what is it exactly?
A cold.
Right? And I mean, these changes, which you can then go and look at the madness of 1914, or you can look at the strange phenomenon of 9/11, where exactly the same you see exactly the same thing, right? The next, about 5 minutes after the plane hits the building, everybody seems to know exactly what just occurred. Nobody asks, maybe we're being played here. Maybe we should take a deep breath. No, everyone knows. And this, where are these changes occurring? What are we living in? Right?
Right.
So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's relevant.
I think Jung has something to say about that. And I think Blake has a lot to say about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So William Blake, we all agree, central, And again, you just, David, made a key point that you're the anti-Ken Burns, not an establishment figure at all.
Not
I'm
an
very, very, very
figure.
grateful for that. I still wondered how you got back accepted to the CBC. Again, in a subtle way, all your programs are subversive. They're subversive. I've been drawn to them for so long.
Well, since I told you the story of my firing, the CBC was very honorable in that matter.
Okay.
I mean, they were perfectly within their rights to fire me, in the sense that I had clearly exceeded boundaries that they announced, believed in, and defended. And they said, we don't want you as a host, because I was then hosting this morning program, but you're welcome to freelance. And I was never impeded in any way after that. I contributed freely to the network. I worked at ideas for another.
Yeah. I mentioned how you interviewed seminal people. When you did shows about people that weren't living, you had Simone Weil, Karl Polanyi, William Blake, and a few others, maybe George Grant. You also did series, that just to show your relevancy too. Can you understand this world without doing a series on, well, we talked about science, but childhood? You did many, many, many on prisons, right? It's again, I just find the whole body of work so totally comprehensive that to get to know you as a person, and my good friend Michael here too, it all starts to make sense when you meet this guy. Then you go see that, in this year he was kind of barking up this tree, and in this year another tree. That's why I just think it's it's the education for our time, and I just can't mince words on that. I can't mince words. Okay. Let's talk about Rene Girard for a little bit. Michael and I come from some churchy circles in one sense. And Rene Girard. Tell me, David, how you did a series on him. I sense, and I don't know if I can articulate it clearly. I could maybe stammer something out, but I sense that his appropriation is different than what he was actually saying sometimes, especially towards the end of his life. I found his name before I discovered your work. I think it was shadow work, to be honest with you. Could have been a different book in a footnote to Illich, but it was, of course, Girard's literary studies, and what Girard was doing that made Illich so fascinated is showing that triangulation in the great novels of Stendhal. I've been a big fan of Stendhal my whole life, and Dostoevsky, that you can see, mimetic desire. You can see somebody wanting something because somebody else wanted it. And talk about science, Illich seemed to glob onto the fact that, like, the social sciences, when they use that scientific, objective, Archimedean viewpoint, cannot get at these things. The essentially human element that draws us to great literature, like Shakespeare, was not there. So that was my entrance point. But tell me about what, where you think people are drawn to him. I know, Michael, that you meet a lot of people, especially some of our younger theologians and our younger priests, who look at the role of the sacrificial victim. And we just talked with William Blake and Ivan Illich about, like, what's unique about the gospel. But Girard can almost be an apologetics tool to say, like, look at this, the scapegoat, only Christianity undermined that. So ergo, everybody should be Catholic Christian. And I just wonder if we're missing some nuance in there. So tell us about your reception of Rene Girard. Yeah.
That's a long story, and please interrupt if I'm still going after 15 minutes. but Girard probably a lot of what happened to me happened through Ivan Illich. And one of the things that happened to me through Ivan Illich was a Norwegian criminologist called Nils Christie.
I was going to mention his name.
A man I loved very much. And once I got to know Ivan, he would say, you should go and see John McKnight. You should go and see Nils Christie. And I knew that's exactly what I should do when he said it. And so through Nils, I was thrown into this world of imprisonment, right? Nils was, at the time I went to see him in Norway in '93, was about to publish a book called Crime Control as Industry, which was emerging out of his sense, having been part of this post-war movement, which dramatically reduced imprisonment in the United States and Canada, as well as in Europe. And suddenly it was just soaring, and Nils perceived, as many perceived, that this was a useful, perhaps indispensable feature of the type of society that was emerging, right?
Mm.
It was crucial symbolically, it was crucial economically, crime control as industry. And he wrote that book, and I did some programs with him that people were interested in. And then
I've got your book here on the expanding prison.
yeah, so that was all, Nils got me into that. And in 1995, he called me and said, I want you to come to Oslo and help me with, he was going to assemble all the people he knew well, and to say, how can we present this as a key political emergency of our time, right? Not just a problem that there's too many people in prison, right? This is a key to our entire political economy. How can we present it? And I had been knocking on everybody's door, and everyone had been saying yes to me, and suddenly Nils was knocking on my door. So I thought, well, you better say yes, because I didn't really want to go any farther on that road, but I ended up going a lot farther on that road, as you just showed the book I did about it. And in the course of that, I met a number of people, broadly speaking, in the abolitionist wing of criminological opinion, who were reading Rene Girard, and got me started, because obviously this scapegoat is an important thing to understand in that connection. So I began to read Girard, and since we mentioned Northrop Frye, I would put Girard in that class of great readers, right? You read Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, his first book.
Mm-hmm.
You're in the presence of an amazing reader, a man who can unfold things for you in a way that is beyond, I should speak personally, beyond me, right? I don't have that same critical, intellectual, spiritual vibrancy or discernment, right? It's just patent how the power of this mind to see. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. As I think all his first books were, and so yeah, I was amazed, and luckily enough, he was willing to spend a few days with me, and that produced this 5-hour series on his thought. But I would say now, of the many things I learned from Girard, I would say the analysis of how the sacred is made is the crucial piece for us now trying to rethink, regenerate. Because if you look how this word is used, right, it's constantly used to stop discussion, to say, get your hands off my sacred, right? You may not touch my sacred. It's not the holy, which is an emanation, you can say, a presence, a felt field this is sacred and you don't touch it or I'll kill you,
Mhm.
or it will kill you, or I will kill you on its behalf.
Yeah.
Whichever it is, right? So that, and he has his imaginary primal scene, right, where people all over presumably in proto-human groups all over the world are in perpetual conflict as a result of their desires alighting on the same objects. Their imitation of each other gets them into this trouble again and again and again and again and again and again. They make the same discovery, which is if all turn on one, right? The one whom they will kill will also save them because the enemy will unify them. And so that sacrifice is how the sacred is made. And I think if we could have a broad awareness of that mechanism, right? That would be a huge part of any possible politics for the future. And it is not to abandon the holy, right? It's not to abandon the hallowed, the whole. It's only to abandon the sacred, right? Which I make in order to keep you away,
right,
from the thing that you may not touch and may not look at, right? And
well,
the veil of the temple was rent in twain. Is
central.
Crucial.
Totally crucial.
It's very important.
Blakean too, that one. Go, Michael. Yeah.
Well, and it's what happens when, this is, psychoanalysts will tell you this: never attack a person in the midst of a delusion that's saying their delusion is erroneous, because they'll turn on you, right?
Yeah.
Which is what happens in the scapegoat mechanism, is that it cranks up or generates the lust for blood. And you see it, I point it out to my students very often. It's something, well, you could look at though I haven't paid attention to it, but you can't avoid it, the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, which is kind of it's a desire for blood on a societal scale, and it's then it gets satisfied, but then it's on to the next, then the cycle starts again, and it starts to crank up, and who the victim will be, who knows, but there will be a victim.
Yes,
there will be a victim.
Can I go a little bit farther with this?
Please.
Because I'm interested in the counsel of others on this point. Because I was so involved with Girard and got to know a lot of people in that milieu and in the colloquium on violence and religion, the question kept coming up, well, what has Girard got to do with Illich, or what does Illich have to do with Girard? And I've never been able to really fully address that question. Ivan, I know, pardon me calling him Illich and then calling him Ivan.
It works.
It's there's the friend and there's the thinker. He had reservations about Girardianism, let's say. He had no reservation.
So do I. Yeah, go ahead.
He was very, the idea of mimetic desire coming out of Deceit, Desire in the novel was very important to him at the time. He was writing books like Shadow Work and Gender, and he felt, and the work of two Girardians, Jean-Pierre Dupuis and what's his co-author?
I'm forgetting the name.
Paul Dumichel.
Yeah.
The Hell of Things, L'Enfer des Choses. Well, that was very important to Illich, but he resisted somehow the system, the idea that this was a comprehensive explanation. Maybe he found it a touch scientific. I'm not sure, because he never really explained it.
That's exactly my worry, is it becomes a system in people's hands, right? They can explain everything, and then I run for the hills. Continue.
That's right.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
that's what I'm wondering. Okay.
Yeah, well, so here's one, that there's a guy, Thaddeus Kaczynski, who wrote a chapter in a book by my friend Guido Peperata on new directions in social and Catholic political research. But he's getting at some of it too, how, and let me first give a quote from Rene Girard too. You can foresee the shape of what the Antichrist is going to be in the future, a super victimary machine that will keep on sacrificing in the name of the victim, right? It's when this system, Girard saw could be used, so you mentioned that your original introduction to Girard was these, prison reform advocates and so forth. And I don't want to make it the right and the left, but since everything is the left, you see some people who have no problems now worshiping, quite often identifying from the left, worshiping the intelligence agencies. We just talked about the FBI, worshiping these huge institutions. This Thaddeus Kaczynski gets at some of the chaos that can come out of it too. He says, the politically correct on the left persecute those they deem the persecutors in the name of the persecuted. The war on terror terrorists of the right terrorize though they deem the terrorists in the name of the victims of terror, victims by terrorists, such as Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which they themselves have created. When it becomes a system, we lose the ability, kind of like an Alan Turing or Kurt Gödel thing. We lose the ability to step outside the system and then to see the joke. I'm struggling to get at it. But once we reduce the insight, there's a novelist I love who became a friend, a Hungarian. His name was Stephen Vizinci, but he taught me. He lived in Toronto, in fact, with Joni Mitchell. Yeah. But he early on, he taught me to say, like, what we need from the great philosophers are not systems, but insights, right? Insights. And
Yes.
I think Girard is he's a insight palooza machine. But once we take him as a system, you get to the point where you could be persecuting people in the name of the victim.
Yes.
And I believe a lot of our thinkers are using Girard in that way, as an airtight system. So on the right, you have young people saying Girard proves that Christianity is unique, ergo be baptized today. And on the left, you get this inadvertent well, I shouldn't even say inadvertent, but you get this persecution coming in the name of the victim.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that he was a lovely man, Rene Girard, and I never really felt that he thought he had the world by the tail. That he would. Maybe he never said that he wasn't a Girardian, but I remember him saying that he was just a kind of critical bulldog, right? Who had got a hold of a good idea and wasn't going to get let go of it till he.
Couldn't it be true
and
that
I
his
think,
insights? Go ahead. Yeah.
And I think that is true in a way, right? That he's. I've often compared him to Fry to try and establish a contrast with Illich, who was very much in the moment. And so the subject that he would take up next would depend heavily on who was facing him at that moment or what he sensed in that moment. Whereas I feel like Girard and Fry very patiently worked out implications of visionary, initial visionary experiences, and patiently and admirably worked out a body of thought based on some original kernel of insight. Not necessarily either thinking they were making a system, but both attacked for making systems and right. Fry, sure. People then later would say this was a kind of dead hand on literary criticism. It was myth criticism. It was archetypal criticism. It was, it was a system. I don't think it ever was really.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I keep thinking, as we talk, I keep thinking of Blake. I must create my own system or be enslaved by another man's, right?
Yes, yeah,
And but he still created his own system.
yeah.
And the point is as you're saying, David, is that that's by following that golden string, as Girard did, as Northrop Frye did, they figure out the implications. I mean, I think, you see where things are going, and it's interesting, though, on the other hand. So people who take these insights of say Frye or Girard or even William Blake, and then try to create a system outside of that system. So you have Girardian critics, and there's a lot of ham-handed Girardian critics out there, a lot of ham-handed deconstructionists, who just have adopted their idea of how this system is supposed to work. And of course, they deliver academic papers on this on a regular basis. But it's a kind of a slavery. It's enslavement, and this is what I think Blake would say, and I think even Illich would notice that. Because they do that, and this is my big beef with literary criticism, being a literary critic, is that these are mind forged manacles that not only get in the way but prevent the critic from seeing what's really there. And in my one book, I talk about it as a kind of, can we have an agapeic criticism that starts in kind of a Goethean phenomenological approach, where we're open to things and we listen to the phenomena before us. So here's an example from Simone Weil, right? The story of one of her mystical experiences came through reading, translating, and memorizing George Herbert's poem Love, where she writes in a letter to a priest that, she would, when she felt a migraine coming on, she would recite this poem to herself. And she said in the letter, and after a while, it took on the virtue of a prayer. And it was during one of these recitations, as I told you before, that Christ himself came down and took possession of me. So that kind of open engagement with things is very foreign to, academic culture in general, but I think even political culture, which disallows what we can call the real from appearing. So I think also kind of could disrupt, like the scapegoat mechanism, for instance, if we found a way to inhabit that space. And I think that's what, for me, one of the things I've learned from Simone Weil, from William Blake, from Ivan Illich, from Northrop Frye, even from Harold Bloom, who can be a little stubborn, is they teach you how to read.
Yes, that's very nice. But then that points to something, Michael, which is the paradox of Blake saying, I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't want to be enslaved, but it's ambivalent, right?
Yeah.
I said that when I was reading Girard, I felt myself to be in the presence of a superior reader. As my acknowledged teacher, throughout my life, I followed Ivan Illich's guidance, let's say.
Yeah.
Right. So there's always going to be a line there, isn't there, between being yourself, thinking for yourself, and recognizing what I need, or the view that can orient me.
Right.
Even if you want, why not say it? The system that can orient me, right? It's a fine line that one learns to walk, right?
But it's a form of communion too.
And if you're lucky, you get a teacher who doesn't want followers.
Exactly.
And I think Rene was one of those.
He didn't
got
want
'em.
followers. Okay, he got him, sure.
He got them, but he didn't
Uh-huh.
want them. And a lot of his followers didn't want to be followers in that sense either, I think. Right?
Yeah.
That is, I mean, nobody is more penetrating than Girard on the dynamics of the teacher and student who become rivals at some point. Right?
Yeah.
The student wants to replace the teacher, and that's a great saying of Girard's, that what is, the central statement of the gospel in a way is imitate the one who's not going to imitate you back,
Mhm.
right? Imitate the one who doesn't want to imitate you. It's so, I think Illich and Girard were both in that way teachers who didn't want followers.
Yeah.
But it was pretty, it was pretty obvious with Ivan that so we didn't threaten each other in any way.
Fascinating. I think I don't know if it actually relates, but the phrase, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. I've kind of taken that for my own life as this image that you could be building something. Blake was working on the four Zoas, and apparently he just couldn't hold together. So he left it as an unfinished masterpiece, and then moves on to Jerusalem. But I have a feeling that, all three of the people we've talked about, Illich, Blake, and Girard, could at the last minute tear down that other thing, or at least have a sense of humor about it, and move on. One of my favorite heroes is a good friend, Roman Catholic priest, is quite brilliant. He'll look at some of his friends and he'll say, "Oh, that guy, he never had the common sense to lose a following," right? He sees one of his friends caught up in the one book they wrote when they were 20, and then keep on working that thing. And he never had the common sense to shake a following. The great teachers know how to, and I think Illich knew how to shake a following. Michael brought up Simone Weil, and I like how all these names are kind of like bringing in, not moving from one to the other, but different strands and illum and so forth. But so David, that was the second, apart from your first one on, I guess, part moon, part traveling salesman. And then I got the book, Ivan Illich in Conversation. I had bought as audio cassettes, your series Enlightened by Love on Simone Weil. And that was so obviously a labor of love. There was one, I'll never forget even the voice intonation, and I'm forgetting the name. It was a Greek name, a Greek scholar on Simone Weil, who I think was dying.
Oh,
himself.
Diogenes. Yeah, he was dying.
Yeah.
Diogenes Allen was his name.
Yeah, and he was talking about suffering, and how sometimes all you can do is say hopomone, patient endurance. Patient endurance.
That's so nice.
Tell people, what were your main takeaways from that deep dive into another figure that we all, many people have read. She's hard to master. She's elusive. What were your main takeaways from this deep engagement with Simone Weil?
Probably, I was aware of Weil through most of my life because of the endorsement of T.S. Eliot, who was very important to me as a poet when I was young. And later, a Canadian philosopher, not well known outside of Canada, George Grant, who also acknowledged Weil as a novel type of modern saint, as Eliot had also said that this was a new type of sanctity we were seeing in Simone Weil. So I probably began to read her more carefully when I was preparing to do some interviews with George Grant. But I would say, I'll take one crucial sentence. She says in a letter to Father Perrin, who was her interlocutor during the time she was in Marseille, that her place is at the intersection of Christianity and everything that is not Christianity. That is, she is transfixed on the threshold of the church.
Yeah.
She cannot move. She is pinned there. If you want, she's crucified there. And she won't let go of what she understands. And I thought, I'm not claiming any likeness to this remarkable lady, but that's where I felt I had spent my life,
Mhm.
right? That I had never left Christianity, nor did I have any idea how, for example, to pass it on to my children as a dogmatic or doctrinal
I think we can all resonate with that.
system. And I hope to make it up to them. I in a certain way, I still have something to say to them on this score. But I couldn't, in other words, I couldn't belong to the kind of congregation where they would have been enculturated in Christianity as I was up to my tip of my.
What was your upbringing, David?
It was deep Anglican. Several of my forebears in Toronto were Anglican priests. My great grandfather, whose portrait is in my living room, was professor of theology, actually, at Trinity College here. And my grandfather was a pillar of the church, but I have no idea what he actually thought. I think
That's great.
his horizon was darkened in a way I still hold by the First World War, where he was badly wounded and shrapnel holes.
Where did he serve?
In Belgium,
Okay.
in Flanders.
Mhm.
He was wounded and left behind German lines and was in a German prison hospital until a year after the war. He finally got back to Toronto.
Wow.
But how that hell related to what went on at St. Simon's Church for him, I never understood it. I wondered if it was impossible to integrate it, that he held as well as he could to ancestral loyalties. And indeed, we fought when I was young and brash, and he was old, about the British Empire.
Mm.
That Roosevelt was pushing the British too hard to dismantle the empire, and all the troubles of the world had come from the premature dismantling of the British Empire.
We'll have to talk about John Milbank in the next, right, Mike?
Yeah.
So this goes back a long way, but I'm trying to tell you my milieu.
Yeah.
My grandfather, whom I adored, was an empire nationalist, a Canadian who would have considered himself his primary identity to be British.
Hmm.
So I was steeped in that Anglican Christianity in such a way that, what I said, I couldn't do that to my children, right? That I belong to it before I belong to myself.
Mm-hmm.
In any conscious way, and so it's simply part of me, right? And in a certain way, my life, my work, what it's been about, comes out of that.
Yeah.
The attempt to understand and to regenerate. I like your word.
Yeah.
You can see that heritage, right? To carry it forward.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Illich is tremendously important in that respect, in this insistence that tradition and innovation can only be considered as a tightly bound couplet. They're each defines the other at any given moment, and what that might mean is harder to say in a given context, right? But
sure.
He also insists that the new church will be the old church reborn. It won't be the old church overcome.
Mm-hmm.
If you can put it like that.
The New Jerusalem.
anyway, so yeah, that I was steeped in that Anglican Christianity, and I would say the first book that really gave me orientation and introduced me to Dietrich Bonhoeffer was Bishop Robinson's book, Honest to God, which was a kind of bestseller in 1964, a work of popularization where he made Tillich and Bonhoeffer and others known to a wider audience. And I began to read Bonhoeffer, and I think that was the beginning of a hope.
Yeah.
For me.
Now there's
So
lots of great.
Weil really advanced that for me as I read my way into her work, and I think it posed dilemmas, contradictions that I'm still chewing on, because I don't know how Illich was oriented to Weil, but he didn't. There was some antipathy. One day he was his very close friend and mine, Lee Hoynatsky, who was a kind of, I sometimes say that he was kind of Sancho Panza.
Whenever I mention his name, I say Lee Hoynatsky, so it's Hoynatsky.
No, he said it Hoynatsky, but it's a strange Polish orthography.
Sure.
You don't write it the way you say it. But there was a book with a picture of Weil on the table, and Ivan pushed it away, and he said,
"Really? That's a great anecdote."
She reminds me of my mother," he said.
That was my experience.
And go on.
No, that was my so I read her. I had a tutorial on Christian existentialism as an undergrad, and I loved her. But after maybe a couple of years later, those books so intimidated me on the bookshelf that I sold them to a used bookstore. And then 15 years later, I need those books back because she's intimidating.
She is intimidating.
There could be various reasons for it. I mean, Ivan preached hedonistic asceticism, which is obviously just a contradiction. But nevertheless, he did preach a hedonistic asceticism, and maybe Weil was a little too masochistic for his taste. Hard to know. But the main thing where I would say, I don't know how to put them together, is that Weil is a Platonist, and Weil insists on 2 points that are both really crucial for me. One is that although the incarnation may be taken as an exemplary event and as perhaps the most fully realized or fleshed out instance of something, it must necessarily be an instance of something that is at all times and in all places available to people. Otherwise, one could not forgive God. This did not make sense to her, that there was a special people, and indeed people thought her anti-Semitic for rejecting.
I wonder if that was part of the Illich brush off,
Well, it may well have been that he felt she was a little humorless in her attacks on the
She
Old
was
Testament.
humorless. Let's all agree on that.
I mean,
completely devoid of humor.
But you can read it, it's very hard to read, right?
Yeah.
That not only must every last shred of the Amalekites be destroyed, but even their livestock has to be destroyed.
Yeah.
This is how hateful these other peoples are, right? You read the story of Abraham, right?
So this makes the conversation between Simone Weil and William Blake fascinating, right? In a way quite different than people who say, oh, there must be an interior meaning for that. Blake rose above that whole kind of dialectic, the way he looked at the Bible just so effortlessly as, again, kind of, he didn't use this language, but explaining, man's ways to God as opposed to God's ways to man, I think.
Yeah.
And he had all these different phases and so forth. Fascinating.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the other point in Weil that was very important to me, is that she says that Christians ought to have been more tactful, I can put it like that, about the resurrection, right? That the resurrection must not be allowed to obscure the crucifixion as the central element in the story.
Do you agree with that or no? Like, I know that's part of hers, and I would flip the script a little bit,
I would say, yes, I do agree with her. Okay. in the sense that what I tried to say about Illich in my book, when I tentatively put forward the idea that he has a tragic view of Christianity, right, is that this is going to go wrong, right? Mm-hmm. Is it bound to go wrong? Do you remember in the Illich book, and I this is in The Rivers North of the Future, but mm-hmm. I've told the story, but he, at a certain moment when he was explaining his understanding of the gospel, very first chapter of the book, he says, I can't go on without saying what I've resisted or avoided saying for 30 years, which was one quantum. It's very, how does he say it? That one.
Well, he goes into the Antichrist.
One has to face the temptation to curse the incarnation.
Right.
He doesn't curse the incarnation, but he says that he can't go on without bringing up the temptation to do so. What is that? He's dramatizing something that is present in the original event, which is going to produce the world that we live in, and that we can barely.
Do you think that, like, and I'm not trying to force these things between, say, Blake, Simone, Weil, or Illich, none of them, but Blake is so clear that the incarnation was going to lead to, I forget his word, the coagulation, the constellation, the congealing of evil, so it could finally be cast out. Now, remember when Illich said he tried to name the modern era as the name of disabling profession, so you could cast it out like a demon.
Yes.
And so that, you see Illich again, like, that it was going to lead to this. I think Illich saw clearly, but what we're seeing in our time, I think especially next week, we're going to talk more about this kind of like, maniacal warfare and this mass psychosis. Blake saw that it had to be congealed so it could be cast out. Michael, you're saying something.
Well, Blake, prisons are built with the stones of law, brothels with the bricks of religion, right? So I've been actually thinking lately, reading a lot of Illich lately, thinking about Blake. And Illich likes this word vernacular.
He does.
And I'm thinking, but I don't think he ever talked about it, but it made me start thinking about vernacular sacraments. How, where, and maybe, so for instance, so I don't know if David knows this. So in the past couple of years, I got so disappointed in the institutional church that we started doing house church with my wife and the 4 kids still at home, and which has been very nourishing and interesting, though it's gotten me into some hot water with some more ecclesiastical friends. But I think of this as in celebrating the Christian festivals as we do, is more vernacular expressions of Christianity rather than institutional expressions. And I remember thinking when the bishops were closing out the churches for COVID, and then some churches in Australia and I think in Canada were saying parishioners who are fully vaccinated may come to confession.
Yes.
I'm like, all right, I'm done. So perhaps the time has come for this to be something we take more seriously. And I think Blake was talking about that in that statement I just gave. And I think maybe that's what Illich was getting at with his statement about the temptation to curse the incarnation, because it created the structure. Well, it indirectly
Yes.
created the structure.
Yeah. So to go back to Weil, then what all she's saying is, Christianity's seemingly in possession of the resurrection, right? That the answer, right? That the whole thing had just been a setup, right? Just a way of getting to the resurrection. Now we've got it. We have the good news. All we need now, I think Faye says, is to design the pedagogical program to which the whole world will become subject. Well,
we did.
It was kind of what happened, and
Yeah.
it's patent in Canada and the same in the States, really, but in the residential schools, which are more of an issue for us here, right? To which the indigenous people were sent and abused there. So that's important to me in Weil, is that she asks for a completely different reception of the gospel and of the incarnation, which I think it moves in the right direction.
I do too.
It moves in the direction I hope to go in.
How about this? Is this an okay place to segue, guys? I think, moments ago, you not even segue, but segue into next week. You had mentioned, we're doing this work this week of reclaiming, and talking about regeneration, but also, David, moments ago, you mentioned about a new church reborn. Michael, very seminally talking about, house church. And I hadn't heard you use that word, but I know an essay's coming, vernacular sacraments. It makes me think of, the tagline I use for some of this is the line from Coventry Patmore. Again, I think he's a radical because he hides behind a name that sounds like a doily that sits next to your old grandmother's Davenport. But he said, the Eucharist was a meal so that every meal might become a Eucharist, right? So we'll pull today to a close. Any final words, David? I want to mention again, Ivan Illich, an intellectual biography from Penn State University Press. You can find it online. Do I have your website correct by saying it's just davidcayley.com?
That's all it is.
I encourage people to read. I was glad you revisited the Gaia thing. We'll talk more about that. But on his blog, read as many of those as you can, prior to next week, especially the one where he's engaging with these great European thinkers on, Ivan Illich on life, so seminal. So is it okay if we'll see each other next week, friends?
It's great.
Yes.
All right. Thanks for signing into the Regeneration Podcast. We'll see you next week.